Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today is historian Abbi Smithmyer. Abbi, how are you today?
Very good. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you very much. Abbi is a occasional contributor here at ECW. She's working on her PhD at the University of West Virginia. And our mutual friend Evan Portman said, "Hey, you should talk to Abbi because on a previous episode of the podcast, I just happened to mention George Washington and kind of the different ways that North and South were kind of contesting his memory." And Evan said, "Hey, Abbi happens to be working on that very subject right now." And so I called her up and I said, "Abbi, we should talk about this."
Yeah.
So, George Washington. Well, first, let's just start with George Washington. What got you interested in the father of our country?
Well, I mean, obviously he's such an influential individual. So many people today highlight his influence in the country and the founding. But studying the Civil War, being so interested in the American Civil War and really what the soldiers talk about and how they felt about the war and their letters really got me interested in kind of what they thought about one of the most influential Americans for them in particular. He just had this reverence by a lot of these soldiers. And so that's something that I really wanted to look into what they talked about, how they talked about George Washington and really the American Revolution as a whole. And and so through looking at their letters and diaries, but also the monuments and the places associated with Washington really kind of piqued my interest. And that's where the whole project started.
And of course, when Washington died, one of the folks who gave him a great memorial said, you know, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts and minds of his countrymen. And that was still true by the time the Civil War came out. The people north and south
Absolutely.
still love the guy and are devoted to him.
Right. Absolutely. And I started to look into, not just what the soldiers were talking about, but even before the Civil War began during that antebellum period, um, what these individuals who would become the soldiers of both the USA and Confederacy, what they learned about George Washington during their youth, the books that they would have been reading, the speeches that they would have been hearing, the newspaper articles, and kind of the culture that got established with Washington and how that reverence for him kind of grew throughout the antebellum period.
Yeah. And I should maybe point out too that like you've had a taste of that. I'm based in Fredericksburg. You've worked at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. This is the land of George Washington's boyhood. And then the armies hunker down here in the winter of 62, 63 and celebrate Washington's birthday on both sides of the river. And so you
Absolutely.
had the chance to kind of dabble in that story while you were here, correct?
Yes, correct. I mean, it wasn't something that I was really researching at the time, but like you said, it's such a key focal point of the Fredericksburg area and those soldiers in particular visiting Ferry Farm, Washington's sister's home being there, you know, his mother's home, the monument to Mary Washington, although it was incomplete during the Civil War, there's all of this going on in that area. And so really, I mean, this is during the Civil War. It's really the first time these soldiers are, the majority of them are able to witness and see these sites that they might have heard about. But the Civil War really allows them to interact with these locations and these places for the very first time.
Yeah, I guess that's a great way to remember that for a lot of these soldiers, North and South, this is a big adventure, and they're going off to see things they've maybe only read about in books, and suddenly like, oh my gosh, there's George Washington's home. You know, like
Yeah,
that's a big deal. Yeah.
exactly. And it's the same for us too. I mean, like you said, working at Fredericksburg in Spotsylvania, or just people visiting the sites in general, the tavern, Mary Washington home, Kenmore, these are the sites that people like to visit to this day. And I think that's the power of the Park Service or these museum sites is, you get to see that location, stand on that same spot where history was made. And it's the same for those soldiers.
Yeah, that power of place, very evocative, something that we're all plugged into really, really well. So we'll get into this more as we go here, but what's the thumbnail argument for Northerners and the thumbnail argument for Southerners who want to say George Washington belongs to us?
I think it's this, in a way, it's very similar for both sides. They're both arguing that they were the true inheritors of the revolution. For the United States soldiers, it's really about that George Washington helped found this nation, and they're fighting to preserve it, and live up to what the Declaration of Independence really laid out. And for the Confederacy, in a way, they're arguing the same thing, but in their perspective, it's really the Union has kind of gone away from what George Washington originally laid out, and his ethos has kind of diverged. And so for the Confederacy, especially for them, they're saying he's a son of the South, he's from Virginia, and so they have that power of the state as well, tying them to Washington's legacy. But for them, their argument is that by seceding, they're really preserving Washington's legacy from the wayward United States.
And I'm just going to interject my own commentary for a
Sure.
second. So the views I'm about to express do not necessarily represent those of Abbi Smithmyer. To me, like, Washington was sort of the odd man out among the Virginia dynasty with those early presidents because, as general of the Continental Army, he understood the need for a really strong central authority that could have a firm guiding hand over otherwise an army that was like herding cats, and logistics it was like herding cats. So that gave a much different perspective on how government should function versus the rest of the Virginia dynasty, which was very decentralized. They all, kind of cut their teeth on the state level, and so really kind of had that state centric perspective. So I always thought it was funny that Southerners are like, yes, we're carrying on Washington's legacy, who believed in a strong federal government. But it's like, how do you as a historian parse that out? Because it seems like, from my perspective, you have to kind of contort yourself to make that argument. But I don't think Southerners had a tough time making it.
No, and I think it gets back to the way, the antebellum period sort of romanticized Washington's legacy. They're decades past Washington's passing, and so they're able to kind of pick and choose the most interesting parts, or the most important elements of his story and his connections to Virginia and the South, and that really kind of allows the Confederates to make that argument, same as the United States soldiers as well. And it gets kind of back to the whole idea of memory, and sort of the meaning that we as individuals place on memory. It's not fixed, it's not stagnant, it's constantly changing and evolving. And I think that's something that I tried to work out through my dissertation and my research as well.
Cherry picking history. Gosh, you never see that happen, do you?
No, never.
You spend a lot of time in your own research, looking at material culture and kind of things that serve to anchor people to Washington's memory, and then they can kind of like, those artifacts kind of sort of take on lives of their own as well. Um, and you were kind enough to share your dissertation with me, which great reading, by the way. And you start out with John Brown and some artifacts, which to me was a really interesting juxtaposition. You think about the formal military career of George Washington versus sort of this very guerrilla warfare style approach that John Brown takes. But of course, the American Revolution is born in some of the same sorts of tactics that Brown. And so, like, to me, the layers of history really added some interesting things to think about there. Why was that an appealing start for you to start telling your story?
That's a great question, because it was something that I kind of decided on towards the later part of my dissertation, to start with that story. But overall, my whole dissertation was really trying to highlight how these objects, or these pieces of material culture associated with George Washington, became part of this larger proxy war between the North and the South on who were the true inheritors of his legacy. And so I thought John Brown's story was kind of the perfect opportunity for that, because it takes place in 1859. And so it's sort of this early example of how Washington's relics become part of this proxy war. And for those who aren't familiar, during or even before John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, he sends kind of advance agents out to sort of scout the area, try and figure out the best path forward. And one of the individuals he pays particular attention to is a great grandnephew of George Washington, Lewis Washington, who had a sword gifted from Frederick the Great to Washington, and then 2 pistols from the Marquis de Lafayette. And so these objects became kind of integral in John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, because he knew that these objects would kind of give him power to the American people. If he had objects once owned by George Washington, then it would give him more power, and cause controversy for the nation.
And he was very tied up in that whole symbolism and, the freeing of the slaves and all that. And of course, if we're going to just throw in one more wrinkle to that story too, so he's opposed by Robert E. Lee, who also has connections to the Washington family as
Right.
well. So, does that all work out for Brown the way well, obviously the whole thing doesn't work out the way he wants, but like, is he able to appropriate any of that symbolic power of the sword and whatever else?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it doesn't go the way Brown had planned, this massive raid that would ignite insurrection beyond Harper's Ferry. But it does create this controversy throughout the nation, both in the North and the South. There's countless newspapers afterwards in the Union kind of saying that he's upholding Washington's legacy, and they note that he had the sword with him when he was captured. And so this was kind of a way to sort of give him credit to carrying on Washington's legacy, and creating a more perfect union. And with that, ending the institution of slavery. Whereas the Confederates, or what would be the Confederacy, many in the white South argued that John Brown was going against everything that Washington envisioned, and that he was a traitor for bringing Washington's objects into his raid. And so on top of the fear of slavery spreading and slave insurrections, the symbolic objects that Brown chose also added into the anxiety that the nation was feeling during that time period as well.
And you point out, I think, kind of in a neat way that depending on your perspective, you could read anything you wanted to in the results of that raid, as far as the Washington relics. Like, oh, look, he failed because Washington wouldn't have approved, or oh, look, he gets saved from being stabbed because of the belt buckle that's holding
Right.
the sword. And so like
Right.
people could grasp at all sorts of straws there if they wanted.
Absolutely.
So and so the war eventually arrives, and people begin evoking Washington almost from the start.
Mhm.
You trace a lot of Daniel Webster's speechifying throughout the 50s, even to kind of lead up into that as an example. And Lincoln, when he stops at Independence Hall, he invokes Lincoln when he's there. What are how did you what did you make of the way people are using Washington in those sorts of contexts as they're trying to influence public opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously it becomes kind of both sides want to connect to Washington's legacy, but I think it also gets back to sort of the reverence that these individuals had for him, and that's built even before Washington passed, and it's growing and growing throughout the antebellum period. But I also think some of the ways that these people are invoking Washington in their speeches or in their accounts ties back into the fact that for a lot of antebellum Americans, George Washington was kind of the father of the nation. And so in a way, his objects or his beliefs for a long while kind of united the nation. And so there was this idea that if they could invoke Washington, then they could also try and keep the nation together. that maybe by having that same view of Washington, that same reverence for him, that could overcome the divide that the nation was going through due to the slavery and its expansion westward.
So, and I won't put you on the spot by having you, read anything or any of that kind of stuff. But yeah, I was really struck by a speech that you quote that Daniel Webster gives, and it's a dedication in D.C. And he's like, "Oh, Father of our country." I mean, it seems so like apostolic. "Oh, Father of the country, we hear you as though it's coming from your live lips today. We'll
Right.
preserve the country that you put together." I mean, very almost melodramatic,
Yes.
and yet very powerful.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, again, I think, I mean, it's that romantic view that these individuals had of Washington, but like you said, I mean, it's this goal of, in a way, I mean, Webster is kind of hinting at the divide that's obviously there within the nation, but um, I think he's trying to emphasize that, if we listen to Washington's word, if we listen to his teachings, then we can overcome this. And if we don't, he's also kind of laying the blame for the would-be Confederates as well.
And to me, well, of course, that's just a big row to hoe. Like, can even George Washington stop this?
Right.
But to me, it also seems like there's a good reason for both sides to claim Washington for their own because, um, if Washington's message is to unify and to bring together, and we just have to listen to him. But if both sides and say, well, we're listening to him and we're hearing this or we're hearing this, that seems
Right.
like a good way to kind of undermine that message of unification.
Right. Yeah. I mean, again, it's that idea that, we can all interpret the past in different ways in the history. And so I think, for a long time, Washington kind of unified the nation, but there was no way to reconcile that divide over slavery and its expansion westward. And so when that became the focal point, um, both sides were able to kind of pick and choose what they wanted to get from that legacy to try and prove that their side was the ones interpreting it correctly.
Yeah. And I really like the way that you discussed kind of Lincoln's appearance in Independence Hall, where he said, he's there where Washington was named commander of armed forces, and it's in Philadelphia where he's sworn in as president the first time, and
Mhm.
so he talks about, gosh, I wonder what it was like to be him. But then he also is like, but I'm also thinking about the officers and soldiers who made that possible. So he kind of really brings it down to a granular level, which
Mhm.
to me was a different way of trying to use Washington than some of the other examples that you picked.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Washington, or I think Lincoln really um, is hoping, obviously, that the war won't come, but he also realizes kind of the severity of it. Um, and Lincoln was very good with, his speeches and the choice of his language and the words that he used and what he invoked. And so I think, he really understood the power of place and the significance that Washington held on the nation's culture, but also that we can't just look at one individual to understand and try and get past this one instance.
Yeah. Now, when the war finally erupts, soldiers flood into Washington, and you talk, and kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier about this, kind of being an adventure for a lot of these guys, um, and people basically go on relic hunts, and that's kind of
Yeah.
how you then kind of get into the material cultureness of Washington.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about, what these relic hunts were. Where are people going? What are they snatching? Why are they doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think today we still have this passion for relic collecting and holding a piece of history. And it was the same for 19th century Americans. Um, One historian talked about this term association items, that were these items that could be linked to a specific event in history, or a person. And they become almost sacred relics. And I think the ones that 19th century Americans really revered the most were ones connected to the founding fathers. And so, for a lot of these individuals, this is the first time they're stepping away from their home state. The majority of these Northern soldiers in particular, this is the first time they're able to, to be in the South. And so they're arriving in Virginia. And so some of the key, places where you see a lot of this relic collecting is Arlington House, with its ties to George Washington. And then more specifically, Mount Vernon was a huge one, because, Washington's tomb is there. It's his home. It's where he kind of, left the nation, left the presidency, left the military, and decided to become a civil citizen once again. And so these were areas that soldiers kind of flocked to, and it just so happened that it's their key military locations as well. So they're constantly in and around these areas and able to visit them, many for the first time.
Yeah. And I can't imagine you recount a story of a soldier who like actually takes a piece of a chair from
Yeah.
Washington's house. It's like, I can't imagine that happening today. But
Yeah, I mean and for them it's not vandalism. They think it's like in a way honoring Washington, that they have a piece of that history that they can hold for themselves. And obviously the majority of these soldiers, they're not able to, to get pieces of a chair of Washington or, a grave or something. But even some of the most interesting ones that I found accounts of is, soldiers at Mount Vernon taking acorns or taking, seeds and things like that, so that, not only can they remember the moment that they were at Mount Vernon, and that connection and that power of place, but, for these individuals that, they're taking these seeds home or sending them home, so that these trees or these plants can be replanted somewhere else. And so they can always have that kind of physical connection with Mount Vernon, even if they're miles away.
yeah, it reminds me. Actually, years ago, I bought a seedling from Monticello that
Yeah,
was descended from a tree that Jefferson had planted right out front of his house. It was an old tree of
right,
poplar, and so I was excited to get a tree to take home. We like, here's a physical connection that I have.
right.
So
Or I mean, I'm sure you've, experienced this, but with the Park Service, so many people love like witness trees.
yeah,
Um, or, if a witness tree falls, they make pens and little knickknacks and things like that. It's different than just being at a site.
yeah.
It's you have that tangible object that, you can remind of that moment that's connected to history.
And it's funny when I read the chair story. I was just reading about when John Adams went to Shakespeare's house in Stratford,
Mhm.
and he writes, as was the custom, he took a piece of the chair, and I was like, I didn't know that was a custom. I don't know a historic home that lets you do that today,
Yeah,
but it apparently was a thing.
right,
So
right.
one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is these guys are, collecting these different sorts of relics and artifacts and connections. So this is before kind of the Great Awakening really sweeps through the armies, and there's that really big, religious revivalism. But it still reminded me very much of, um, like the Catholic tradition of having these arctics and reliquaries and
Mhm.
sort of these, the bones of the saints and the splinters of the cross and those sorts of things where it's religious in nature. And the way these guys were treating these relics of Washington was sort of like a secular religiousness, which to me was really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're right. Some of these soldiers even will talk about how like these are sacred relics, and they attach that kind of religious connotation to them. Um, and in a way, I think some soldiers did kind of put Washington in that deity realm of, I mean, he wasn't just revered because, he was a founding father, but it almost took on more of a religious connotation to it. And you can kind of see some of the ways that they talk about that. We talked about Fredericksburg a little earlier, but there's soldiers talking about how Confederate soldiers said that, they won that battle because they were protecting, the tomb of Mary Washington, and they felt that she was kind of looking over them. And I hadn't really ever seen soldiers' accounts of that. You see that with them talking about like God was on our side, and that's why we were successful at this battle or that battle. And you see soldiers saying that, but this was really kind of the first instance where I saw soldiers, saying that the mother of Washington was the one looking over them as if, a god or a religious figure would. And that's why they were successful in the battle.
And that's one of the, I think, interesting facets of the Battle of Fredericksburg, particularly. So the battle happens right around the anniversary of Washington's death, and then the armies are both there in encampment for Washington's birthday. And so both of those events that are very Washington specific tie in with both of those armies in pretty interesting ways on the
Yeah,
soldier level.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, they're always, and I think if you want to find those connections, you're always going to look for them. And I think for the soldiers who are, on the ground, um, and surrounded by that revolutionary history and that history connected to Washington, specifically at Fredericksburg, they're constantly noticing those connections and playing into them as well.
Now, when your book, really gets going and you deal with a lot of different examples of material culture, did you have a favorite story that really kind of jumped out at you or something that surprised you particularly about the way these guys were using these artifacts?
Um, that's a good question. I I don't necessarily think it's might not necessarily be my favorite um part because it's not necessarily connected to a specific relic, but I really was fascinated with this idea of like a living relic. And the first time I kind of came across that when doing my research was talking about the soldiers interacting with Arlington House. And I found a couple of accounts. One was before the Civil War. There was a historian meeting with George Washington Parke Custis to write a history of a biography of Washington, basically. And he found out that one of George Washington Parke Custis's enslaved laborers, Selina Gray, or sorry, I'm blanking on her name right now, but one of the enslaved laborers at Arlington House before the war was a descendant of, or she was once at Mount Vernon.
Yeah.
Caroline was her name, and she was actually present at George Washington's death. And so, as a way for her to kind of get compensation for her story, because this historian was so interested in, getting that firsthand account from Caroline about George Washington's death, she negotiated with George Washington Parke Custis to have her grandson manumitted. Um,
Wow.
and so I just think that's one of the most powerful stories that, this historian is so invested in sharing, the story of George Washington's death, and kind of seeing Caroline as sort of a living relic that can tell the story of Washington's death because she was present there, that George Washington Parke Custis was willing to manumit an enslaved child to ensure that story got told. And I also think that's just a powerful story that, that enslaved individuals they knew their worth and they knew the power that Washington had in the 19th century. And so they're willing to kind of ensure that they get compensation for that.
Wow. And thinking about that, and I'm just riffing here, but like even just the memory of Washington means liberty, like
Yeah,
which, when he's alive, of course, right?
right. And again, I mean, it ties in, that sort of ties into sort of the union's claims that they're upholding his legacy because, they're the army fighting to end the institution of slavery, and free, millions of individuals. So For them, they're tied to that story of freedom and that connection to George Washington.
And it's worth noting Washington was the only one of the founders who freed his slaves upon his death.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was troubled by that institution, and like many other people in his time, couldn't quite escape it while he was still alive. But upon his death, he did something about it.
Right, right. And I think that's why so many, I talk a little bit later in my dissertation about the amount of USCT troops that many of them were enslaved and are able to escape and join the United States military. And for many of them, they'll take the last name Washington, or they'll take the name George Washington. And so again, that's kind of the way to not only tie to that idea of George Washington and the idea of freedom, but really doing what Washington didn't in the end, and ensuring that not just Washington slaves were set free, but that millions of enslaved individuals throughout the United States were finally freed.
Yeah. Let me go back to the you mentioned Arlington a second ago. Did folks, and I imagine like Northerners particularly, probably had some really ambivalent feelings about Arlington because it was the Lee House, but there are also these Washington connections to it. Um,
Yeah.
what kind of territory is that to navigate?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what we know of Arlington today is due to the fact that Robert E. Lee had that connection to Arlington, that it was his home, before the war, and so the United States ensures that he'll never be able to return by making it a national cemetery. But yeah, these soldiers are not only grappling with the fact that this is a house connected to Robert E. Lee, but it's also a house connected to George Washington. And so a lot of these individuals, again, they'll United States soldiers will use that as an example of not only Lee, but the Confederacy as a whole, diverging from Washington's legacy. The fact that Lee is casting his lot with the Confederacy. He's joining the Army of Northern Virginia. So this is proof to them that he has gone astray, and that he doesn't deserve that connection to George Washington. And I think you kind of see that with the soldiers' letters, because they talk about Lee as a traitor and going against Washington's legacy, while at the same time the United States military tried to put up guards to protect the house. Once they found out that there were still objects associated with Washington inside the home, they went about very quickly trying to gather up all of those objects and place them on display at that point in the patent office in DC, so that it was available for others to see. So I think you get that connection where they're not only discrediting Lee for abandoning the United States and the nation that Washington helped found, but also kind of revering the house itself because of its connections to Washington.
Yeah. And what about, the Capitol itself is named after Washington. It's surrounded by Maryland, which is a slave state, although it remains a border state, it doesn't leave the Union. Virginia, a slave state, it secedes. So the symbolic value of Washington's name on the Capitol, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting area that these soldiers have to navigate, because they're, again, a lot of them this is the very first time they're actually seeing the nation's capital, and getting to witness kind of the lay of the land, and seeing all of these landmarks and these the Capitol being built. The Washington Monument is another big one that soldiers talk about. But at the same time, these grounds are being transformed by war. You have these camps being set up, the training grounds being set up. And so it's constantly transforming because of the Civil War. But again, they notice that connection to George Washington, the specific name of, the nation's capital being connected to him. And so for them, it's a way to um, connect physically with the site, that power of place. They're on the grounds itself, but also kind of that cultural connection that they would have had during the antebellum period, and that idea of we don't just need to preserve the capital, but we also need to preserve Washington's memory and his connections to this place. And so I think you see those connections, in their letters talking about the capital's connections to Washington and all of the sites associated with him. But it also helps that a lot of Washington's relics are kind of preserved around DC. Like I said, in the patent office, a lot of Washington's military, accoutrements are preserved there, and so they're able to visit these locations. And so that connection that the city has to Washington is only boldened by the objects on display there as well.
Yeah. You mentioned the Washington Monument a second ago.
Mhm.
That's a very powerful symbol that the North has. The South also has a very powerful symbol in the Washington statue outside the Virginia Capitol. Uh, Talk to me just a little bit, like how do both sides use these very powerful symbols to try to lay claim to Washington's legitimacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Washington Monument for the United States soldiers, it's incomplete at the time that the Civil War erupts. But there was this large campaign to kind of fundraising campaign throughout the nation prior to the Civil War to help build the monument. And so these soldiers in the United States would have been familiar with the campaign to erect this monument ahead of time. And so a lot of them were kind of aware of it when they arrive in DC and see the incomplete monument. And for a lot of ways, soldiers talk about in their accounts, they look at the incomplete Washington monument as sort of a larger symbol of the nation, that the Civil War, they need to preserve the Union so that the nation can be whole again. And you kind of see that connection with the Washington Monument, that it's standing incomplete. And so there's still work that needs to be done. And so for them, we need to bring the Confederates back into the United States, preserve the nation so that we can complete the monument in honor of Washington. And I think it gets back to that idea that, the nation, it's always growing, it's always improving. And for a lot of them, especially by 1863, they're fighting to end the institution of slavery and make the country a better nation as a whole. And you can kind of see that with the Washington Monument. But as
Yeah.
you said, with the Confederates, the statue of George Washington on the Virginia Capitol grounds, that's something that they really invoke. This is something that the Confederates argue that they're, preserving his legacy by completing this monument before the Civil War, at least the base of it, and the statue itself. Some of the other Virginia politicians won't get added until after the fact. But the statue of Washington is complete, and they kind of use that in Washington's connections to the state of Virginia to kind of give legitimacy to the Confederacy. And you really see that with Jefferson Davis's inauguration in 1862. He stands in front of the George Washington statue, and he invokes Washington's legacy. The inauguration takes place on Washington's birthday. And so they're constantly making these connections. Jefferson Davis is very deliberate in making these connections with George Washington, but also arguing that the Confederacy is taking part in a second revolution. And then the Confederates are going to use the image of that statue as the seal of the Confederate States of America. So they're constantly invoking, not just Washington's legacy, but that statue in particular to kind of connect them to him.
Yeah. I mean, I should point out to a lot of people kind of forget that when Davis was sworn in as president in Montgomery, Alabama. That's just of the provisional Confederate government. But then they kind of do like an official when they get to Richmond, reestablish the capital there, and have
Right,
this. So that's when he actually starts his term as first president of the Confederacy.
right, right. And again, like, I mean, it's so the entire ceremony is so central to that statue of George Washington.
Yeah.
This isn't them, they're trying to make that connections to the revolution, to his legacy, and really arguing that they're the true inheritors of what the United States was meant to be, by invoking that image.
As you head into the home stretch in your dissertation, you talk about, Lincoln comes into the city of Richmond after the fall and he's touring. And that statue of Washington was pretty much untouched during the war. And so it's still there and it dominates the skyline from its position on the edge of the hill there.
Yeah.
Um, Walk me through that moment and kind of like, ooh, the dust is now settling. Now what? And there's Washington front and center.
Right. I mean, this is I think the statue really, it tells so many different stories. And I think that's why I really wanted to emphasize it, at the end of my dissertation, because, like you said, it has that story with Jefferson Davis. It has, the story, the seal of the Confederacy. But then it also has that connection when Abraham Lincoln arrives in Richmond, on April 4th, and one of the first places he goes to is to that statue. And in a way, it's kind of, okay, we've done everything that, we set out to do. The war isn't over. There's still much that needs to be done. But this is kind of the first step in rebuilding the nation and reconnecting, the two nation, the United States and the Confederacy back into one, and getting back to what Washington established, back, in the 1700s. So
And to me, it was an interesting juxtaposition because, of course, we elevate Lincoln to that same sort of level today.
yeah.
At the time, there were plenty of people who would have never guessed that would have happened.
Right. Very true.
So to me, that's just like, gosh, what's going through his mind at that moment? It's a
Yeah.
pretty incredible moment. And you see that.
Yeah. And I think it gets back to that idea that, we collectively, we can have meaning placed on things. We can collectively revere Washington, or today, collectively praise Lincoln, for his actions during the Civil War. But for individuals, they can look at an object like that's George Washington statue in Richmond, and get different meaning from it.
Mhm.
And that was something that I really tried to emphasize. For white Confederates, they're going to get a different meaning from it than Abraham Lincoln or the United States, colored troops who, arrive in Richmond and walk past the statue.
Yeah.
They're going to get a different meaning than Lincoln would have, or than certainly Jefferson Davis would have. And so this one object can hold countless different meanings for the individuals, depending on who you are.
And to me, I think that's so illuminating because, obviously statues are a lightning rod for controversy today.
Right.
And people see different things in different statues, but I think they forget that other people see other things. Like a statue doesn't mean this, it means this to you, but it means
Right.
that to that person.
Right. Yeah. That the meaning placed on these objects, and specifically, like you said, statues, it's not fixed, it's not stagnant. It can be manipulated and changed depending on who's interpreting it. And you really get that, with the statue in Richmond, and all these different individuals finding different meaning from it.
So as you looked at both sides and different constituencies within each side, sort of grappling with these issues of memory and what George Washington specifically means, um, what takeaways did you come away with? And what advice might you give to folks as they're finding themselves in that same sort of tug of war?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I mean, kind of like I just said, I think the biggest thing is that, um, we need to think deeper about these individuals, and kind of the meaning we place on individuals or events that, depending on our background, our history, that we might have a different meaning placed on them. And so to kind of think about how other people might interpret these individuals, or these objects, these statues, these historic homes, for instance, that there's all of these different meanings and interpretations placed on them. And even though there might be, an overarching kind of collective meaning that we have, that we've sort of accepted, that it doesn't mean that that's the only one that exists. And then also I think, a big one too is that we can learn a lot from the objects that 19th century Americans kind of revered. And so it's not just the written accounts, but you can learn about what Civil War soldiers thought, what were important to them during the war, by the objects that they interacted with. And so there's a lot that we can learn by studying kind of the material culture of the Civil War, as well as, the military campaigns and things like that as well.
Yeah. So as we get ready to wrap up here, what did you learn about George Washington by doing all this that maybe you didn't realize before?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I did learn is that maybe our interpretation of him in the 21st century was different than how 19th century Americans viewed him.
Hmm.
And so that's something that I really kind of enjoyed, piecing together, that, my ideas or beliefs, or understanding of George Washington wasn't the same as how 19th century Americans viewed him.
Hmm.
And so that was like a good reminder of, um, we can't take our expectations and our beliefs and apply them to people in the past as well. And so we need to kind of learn what, how they were educated and how they understood the past, to get a better sense of how they interpreted the Civil War as well.
Yeah, yeah. And Washington's one of those figures that, he has become so mythologized and he's 250 years in the past, so that it's hard to see him as a real person. But I think if we appreciate him as a real person, I think it makes what he did all the more extraordinary as
Yeah,
opposed to just sort of leaning into that mythology about him. But that's
absolutely.
always a challenge, is capturing who this person really was.
Right, right, absolutely. And yeah, again, depending on who you are, you're going to have different interpretations of him. And because there's so much known about him, that kind of complicates as well.
Yeah.
Because you're never going to know or be able to learn everything about this one individual.
Yeah. Anything I haven't asked you that I should have that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, I think, I just really enjoyed the talk. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll make this promise to you, because normally I don't tap into someone's dissertation, because now there are going to be people who listen to this and be like, oh, I want to read that. And they
Right.
can't yet because, it hasn't been turned into a book, but it's a really good piece that I'm sure will become a book someday. And my promise to you is that when it does, I'll bring you back on and we'll just talk about this all over again. So then people will be like, oh, I want to read that book. And then they can go get it.
Sounds great.
All right. Cool.
Sounds great.
Abby, thanks for spending some time with me today.
Thank you.
Great to see you again. I'm Chris Mikowski on behalf of the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.